The story of MK Ultra does not begin with laboratories or experiments. It begins with fear. It was the early 1950s. The Second World War had ended only a few years before, leaving cities in ruins and nations scarred. But instead of peace, a new kind of war was brewing, one without tanks, trenches, or bombs. It was the Cold War, a global contest of ideology and power. On one side stood the United States, defending democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, expanding communism across Europe and Asia. This war was fought in whispers, in the shadows, and in the minds of men. For the American intelligence community, the threat was not just nuclear weapons or Soviet spies. It was something more elusive, more terrifying. The idea that the human mind itself could be weaponized. Reports trickled in of captured US soldiers in Korea who had returned home apparently brainwashed. Their loyalty shaken, their words echoing enemy propaganda. Were the Soviets already ahead in some kind of psychological warfare? Could they bend human thought, erase free will, and implant obedience? The questions haunted Washington. The fear grew, and out of that fear, one of the most secretive and disturbing projects in American history was born. Its name, MK Ultra. The name itself was clinical, almost meaningless, a bureaucratic code, one among many stamped on classified files. But what it represented was a program unlike anything before it. Authorized in 1953 by CIA Director Alan Dulles, MK Ultra was designed to explore the boundaries of the human mind. Could thoughts be controlled? Could memories be erased or created? Could a person be reprogrammed like a machine? These were not abstract philosophical questions. To the CIA, they were matters of national survival. If America's enemies mastered mind control, they believed democracy itself could collapse. So, the agency resolved to act first, to explore every possibility, no matter how dangerous, how unethical, or how inhumane. At the center of this new project stood Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a quiet demeanor but an extraordinary assignment. He was the CIA's poisoner-in-chief, tasked with overseeing a network of secret experiments stretching across universities, hospitals, prisons, and even hidden CIA safe houses. Gottlieb's job was to push science beyond its limits, to explore whether drugs, hypnosis, or shock could unlock the secrets of the human psyche. But from the very beginning, there was a problem. In order to answer these questions, the CIA needed test subjects, real people, and obtaining their consent was inconvenient. As we will see, this decision would cast a shadow not just over science, but over countless lives. To understand why MK Ultra happened, we need to step into the mindset of the 1950s. America was gripped by paranoia. Soviet influence seemed to spread everywhere, from Eastern Europe to Asia to whispers of communist infiltrators in Washington itself. The Red Scare had fueled suspicion of neighbors, teachers, even Hollywood stars. Fear was not just an emotion, it was policy. And when fear drives policy, ethics often fall away. In April 1953, Alan Dulles gave a speech that hinted at the coming storm. He warned of brain warfare, a new battlefield where the mind was the ultimate prize. Within weeks, he signed the order authorizing MK Ultra. Behind closed doors, money was funneled into covert projects, grants disguised as academic research, and secret laboratories where the limits of morality would be tested. The official line was simple. America had to be prepared for anything. If the Soviets were experimenting with the human mind, the US could not afford to lag behind. But in reality, no one truly knew what the Soviets were doing. Much of the intelligence was rumor, misinterpretation, or fear magnified into fact. MK Ultra was not just science. It was a symptom of Cold War anxiety, a desperate attempt to control the unknown. The secrecy surrounding the project was absolute. Few in government knew it existed. Fewer still understood its scope. Files were marked top secret, reports carefully sanitized. The public would not hear the name MK Ultra for decades. In the 1950s, it was invisible. A ghost haunting the corridors of the CIA, operating in plain sight yet hidden from view. But for those caught in its web, the project was all too real. Students recruited for research studies, patients in hospitals treated as test cases, prisoners offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation. Many had no idea they were stepping into a CIA experiment. They were simply told it was science. Few could have imagined what science would mean under MK Ultra. This was the beginning. A project born in fear, nurtured in secrecy, and justified by national security. A project that would blur the line between defense and abuse, between research and violation. As we step deeper into this story, we will uncover the methods, the victims, and the lasting legacy of MK Ultra. But it all began here, in the shadows of the Cold War, where fear became policy and secrecy gave birth to a program that would haunt history. If the Cold War planted the seeds of paranoia, 1953 was the year those seeds sprouted into something extraordinary and terrifying. On April 13th of that year, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed a memorandum that would quietly authorize a new program. It would operate outside the boundaries of law, shielded from oversight, hidden behind layers of classification. Its name, like so many bureaucratic inventions, was clinical and unremarkable, MK Ultra. But within those two words lay an ambition both bold and dangerous, to seize control of the human mind. Dulles himself had laid the groundwork only weeks earlier. In a speech to Princeton alumni, he warned of what he called brain warfare. He spoke of communist enemies using brain perversion techniques to break prisoners and bend them into instruments of propaganda. The speech was vague, but the fear was sharp. If the Soviets had cracked the code of mind control, America was already behind. And so, with a few strokes of a pen, MK Ultra was born. At the center of this program stood a man who seemed almost out of place in the halls of espionage. Sidney Gottlieb was not a spy or a soldier. He was a chemist, soft-spoken and unassuming. But beneath that mild exterior was a man with a mission: to push science to its furthest edges, wherever they might lead. He had already earned a reputation inside the CIA as a kind of magician, a figure willing to explore poisons, drugs, and unorthodox solutions to the agency's problems. In time, he would be known as the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Under Gottlieb's leadership, MK Ultra became an umbrella program, not a single experiment, but a network of research projects scattered across the United States and even overseas. Some were run directly by the CIA in hidden safe houses. Others were disguised as academic grants, funneled through front organizations so that universities and hospitals never suspected who was really funding their studies. The objectives were as broad as they were unsettling. Could a drug compel someone to tell the truth? Could hypnosis plant ideas or even erase them? Could sensory deprivation break down the human will? Could electroshock or psychological conditioning transform a prisoner into a puppet? The possibilities seemed limitless. The methods, at least on paper, were bound only by imagination. In practice, of course, the methods required subjects, living, breathing human beings. And this is where MK Ultra crossed its darkest line. Consent, in the traditional sense, was often ignored. Some subjects volunteered for research without realizing who was behind it or what the real purpose was. Others had no choice at all. Patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners behind bars, soldiers unaware of the chemicals placed in their drinks. To the CIA, these individuals were not people but data points, opportunities to test whether the mind could be hacked like a machine. At the time, there were no committees for research ethics, No informed consent standards as we know them today. But even by the looser standards of the 1950s, many of MK Ultra's experiments were extraordinary violations. Doctors who partnered with the CIA often never asked questions. Some may not have wanted to know the answers. One of the program's most famous obsessions was a substance that, at the time, was virtually unknown to the public: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. To Gottlieb and his colleagues, it seemed like a miracle drug, a key to unlocking the unconscious mind. Could it break down barriers? Could it open a prisoner's psyche wide enough to be rewritten? In the early years of MK Ultra, LSD became the crown jewel, tested on everyone from volunteers to unsuspecting CIA employees. But LSD was only one tool in the kit. MK Ultra explored hypnosis, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, electroconvulsive therapy, and combinations of them all. Sometimes the experiments were structured and scientific. Other times, they were reckless, improvised, and cruel. Money flowed freely. The CIA set aside millions of dollars, an extraordinary sum for the time, to bankroll research under the MK Ultra umbrella. University professors received funding without ever knowing its true origin. Hospitals were approached with offers they could hardly refuse. Safe houses were set up in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes, unknowingly employed by the CIA, lured men who were then secretly dosed with drugs as agents observed behind two-way mirrors. All of this operated under the cloak of secrecy. Officially, MK Ultra did not exist. Reports were coded, names were omitted, and access was tightly restricted. Even within the CIA, only a small circle knew the full scope of what was happening. The justification was always the same: national security. America was in a fight for survival, and if controlling the mind could tip the balance, no cost was too great. The men in charge convinced themselves that they were protecting freedom, even as they undermined the very principles that defined it. By the time the program was in full swing, dozens of sub-projects were running simultaneously, each probing a different angle of psychological control. The CIA's ambitions were vast, but one question loomed over them all. Could a human being truly be broken and rebuilt, their free will stripped away, their mind turned into a weapon? That was the dream of MK Ultra. And as the program expanded, so too did its victims. People whose lives would be forever altered in experiments they never agreed to. This was not science fiction. It was science funded by the state, hidden from the people it claimed to protect. MK Ultra was no longer an idea. By the mid-1950s, it was a reality, alive, expanding, and already leaving scars. When we think of science, we often picture volunteers in white coats, laboratories with clear rules, and participants who sign up willingly. MK Ultra was nothing like that. The CIA's obsession with controlling the human mind wasn't confined to theory or laboratories. It spilled out into the lives of unsuspecting people: prisoners, hospital patients, students, even civilians who thought they were walking into a simple medical study. Many never had the chance to say yes. Many didn't even know. The program's philosophy was simple: results mattered more than consent. And under Sidney Gottlieb's leadership, that philosophy shaped a decade of human experimentation that blurred the line between research and abuse. Take the prisons. Across America, inmates were offered early release or lighter sentences if they agreed to participate in experiments. But what they were not told was the nature of those experiments. Some were given massive doses of LSD, far beyond what anyone had studied before. The prisoners were then observed as they experienced terrifying hallucinations, disorientation, and psychological breakdowns. To the CIA, this was data. To the prisoners, it was trauma. Trauma from which many would never fully recover. Then there were the hospitals. Psychiatric patients, already vulnerable and often unable to advocate for themselves, were seen as perfect subjects. They were told they were receiving new treatments, experimental therapies that might help them. What they were not told was that these therapies were part of MK Ultra. They were subjected to high-voltage electroshock, heavy sedatives, hypnosis, and extended sensory deprivation. Some patients remained in dark rooms for days or weeks, their minds unraveling under the weight of isolation. One particularly chilling case took place in Canada, at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. There, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist funded indirectly through MK Ultra, conducted what he called psychic driving. Patients were kept sedated for weeks at a time, bombarded with repeated recorded messages, and subjected to extreme electroshock treatments. Cameron believed he could erase their personalities and rebuild them from scratch. In reality, many were left with severe memory loss, cognitive damage, and broken lives. Most had come to the hospital seeking help for anxiety or depression. They left as shadows of themselves. And then there were the unsuspecting civilians. The CIA established safe houses in San Francisco and New York under a sub-project called Operation Midnight Climax. Prostitutes, secretly on the CIA payroll, lured men to these apartments. Once inside, the men were given drinks laced with LSD while agents observed from behind two-way mirrors. The goal was to study the drug's effects in real-world conditions. The men never knew they were part of an experiment. They thought they were paying for a night of companionship, not being dosed by their own government. Even members of the CIA were not safe. In a disturbing twist, some agency employees were secretly dosed with LSD by their own colleagues, just to see what would happen. One man, Frank Olson, whose story we'll explore in depth later, would never recover from such an incident. For others, the result was paranoia, breakdowns, and an inability to trust even the people they worked alongside. The randomness of these experiments meant that almost anyone could become a subject. A college student signing up for a paid research study might unknowingly swallow a capsule of LSD as part of an MK Ultra project. A hospital patient seeking treatment might instead be trapped in weeks of sensory isolation. The scope was staggering. By some estimates, thousands of people were touched by MK Ultra, many without ever realizing it. The effects were devastating. Some victims never regained their mental health. Families were left to cope with loved ones who had been fundamentally changed. Lawsuits were filed years later, but the government's secrecy and the destruction of records made accountability almost impossible. For many, closure never came. What makes these stories particularly haunting is not just the suffering, but the casual way in which it was inflicted. To the CIA, this was research, necessary, urgent, and justified by the specter of communism. But to the people on the receiving end, it was violation. They had their agency stripped away, their trust betrayed, their lives altered without consent. Even now, decades later, the stories of these victims echo with unease. They remind us that MK Ultra was not just a program of files and laboratories. It was a program of people, real human beings who became the raw material of an experiment their government refused to acknowledge. As the experiment spread and the methods multiplied, one substance became the centerpiece of MK Ultra, LSD. It was seen as the key, the magic bullet that could unlock the human mind. And in the next chapter, we'll follow the journey of this drug, how it was tested, how it escaped into the wider world, and how it would ultimately shape not just CIA experiments, but an entire generation. When Sidney Gottlieb first laid his hands on lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, he believed he had found the Holy Grail. Discovered in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, LSD had only begun to reveal its strange, unpredictable powers. In small doses, it altered perception. In larger ones, it shattered reality altogether. Hoffman himself described his first experience as a journey through dreamlike hallucinations, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. To most scientists, LSD was a curiosity. To Gottlieb and the CIA, it looked like a weapon. Could this substance unlock the deepest recesses of the mind? Could it tear down a person's defenses, strip them bare of secrets, and leave them vulnerable to suggestion? Could it, in short, become the ultimate truth serum, or worse, a tool for reprogramming human thought? With those questions in mind, LSD became the crown jewel of MK Ultra. The experiments began inside the CIA itself. Gottlieb ordered that LSD be tested on agency employees, often without their knowledge. Some agents drank their morning coffee laced with the drug, only to find their workday spiraling into chaos. Others were deliberately observed while high, to see if they could still perform their duties or if their behavior could be manipulated. The results were unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. But the CIA didn't stop with its own. LSD was administered to soldiers, prisoners, mental patients, and civilians. Some received tiny doses. Others were given amounts so massive that they spiraled into psychological breakdowns. To the agency, these outcomes were valuable data. To the victims, they were often life-shattering experiences. One of the most infamous subprojects was Operation Midnight Climax. In apartments disguised as brothels, unsuspecting men were lured in by sex workers secretly employed by the CIA. Behind two-way mirrors, agents watched as these men were dosed with LSD, their reactions carefully recorded. The experiments were supposed to reveal how the drug affected behavior in real-world settings. What they revealed, more often, was the reckless cruelty of a government testing its citizens without their consent. The CIA's obsession with LSD wasn't just about interrogation or manipulation. There were wilder theories, too. Could LSD be sprayed over enemy troops to disable them? Could an enemy leader be dosed secretly, his credibility destroyed by drug-induced madness? Gottlieb even mused about slipping LSD into Fidel Castro's cigars. To the agency, no idea was too outlandish to consider. But LSD was unpredictable. Sometimes it produced euphoria and openness. Other times it brought paranoia, terror, and psychosis. It was not the controllable tool the CIA had hoped for. Instead of yielding a formula for mind control, it revealed the fragility and individuality of the human psyche. And yet, in chasing their dream, the CIA inadvertently lit a fuse that would burn far beyond their secret labs. Some of the researchers involved in MK Ultra were academics, men who received CIA funding without always knowing its source. They studied LSD in controlled settings, published papers, and, in the process, exposed the drug to a wider scientific community. A few even shared it with friends and colleagues outside the laboratory. Slowly, LSD began to seep out of the shadows of intelligence work and into the world beyond. By the early 1960s, figures like Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist, were championing LSD as a tool for expanding consciousness rather than controlling it. What the CIA had hoped would be a weapon of domination became, in the hands of a new generation, a symbol of liberation. This was one of the great ironies of MK Ultra. In trying to control the human mind, the CIA helped introduce a drug that would inspire a counterculture defined by rebellion, free thought, and distrust of authority. The very substance the agency hoped to use against enemies became part of a movement that questioned government itself. But for all its cultural impact, the darker side of LSD remained. The men and women who had been dosed without consent carried scars that were never healed. Some lived with permanent psychological damage. Families struggled to understand what had happened to their loved ones. And in some cases, like that of Frank Olson, a CIA scientist whose death we will explore in the next chapter, the consequences were fatal. By the late 1950s, the agency was beginning to realize that LSD was not the magic bullet they had hoped for. It was too erratic, too uncontrollable. Still, the experiments continued, expanding into new techniques, new drugs, and new victims. For Gottlieb and his team, the quest for mind control was far from over. LSD had opened a door, but it had not provided the key. And so MK Ultra pressed on, searching for answers in darker and darker places. In the next chapter, we turn to one of the most haunting stories of all, the case of Frank Olson, a man caught inside MK Ultra's web, whose life ended in tragedy and mystery. The story of MK Ultra is filled with secrecy and silence, but few moments pierced that silence like the death of Frank Olson. Olson was not an outsider. He was one of them, a scientist, a government employee, a man working inside the walls of America's Cold War research. He had been recruited to join the CIA's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where he worked on biological warfare and chemical research. By all accounts, he was intelligent, dedicated, and loyal to his country. But in November 1953, something happened that would change everything. That month, Olson attended a retreat with colleagues in the woods of Maryland. It seemed routine, just a group of scientists gathering for discussions. But what Olson didn't know was that he was about to become a subject in the very kinds of experiments he had been helping to oversee. During the retreat, Sidney Gottlieb and his team decided to secretly dose Olson's drink with LSD. He was not told. He did not consent. He simply drank his glass of liquor, unaware that it had been spiked. Soon after, Olson began to unravel. He grew anxious, paranoid, and deeply unsettled. At first, his colleagues brushed it off as part of the experiment, data to be observed. But Olson's distress deepened in the days that followed. He confided in friends that he no longer trusted his work. He told his wife that he wanted to leave the CIA altogether. He began questioning not only the morality of the projects he was involved in, but also his own role in them. For a man working in the world of secrets, doubt was dangerous. The CIA sent Olson to New York City, reportedly to receive psychiatric treatment. He checked into the Hotel Statler with a CIA officer assigned to watch over him. Days later, in the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Olson plunged to his death from the window of his 13th floor hotel room. He was 43 years old. The official explanation was suicide. The agency told his widow and children that he had been struggling with stress and depression, and that his death was a tragic personal choice. But the truth, as it emerged decades later, was far murkier. Olson's family was left devastated, not only by his death but by the secrecy that surrounded it. For years, they lived with questions that had no answers. Why had Frank suddenly become unstable? Why was he in New York? And why, if it was suicide, did so many details not add up? In the 1970s, when the veil of MK Ultra was finally pierced by congressional investigations, the family learned the shocking truth. Frank Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge as part of a CIA experiment. The revelation confirmed their worst fears, that his death was not a simple suicide, but the tragic consequence of a reckless program operating in the shadows. Even then, the mystery did not end. Some investigators suggested Olson may have been murdered. If he had threatened to leave the CIA or expose its secrets, was he silenced to protect the program? The evidence was inconclusive, but the suspicion never faded. In 1994, Olson's body was exhumed, and forensic experts concluded that injuries to his head suggested he had been struck before falling. The possibility of foul play grew stronger. For Olson's family, the search for truth became a decades-long struggle. They received an official apology from President Gerald Ford in 1975, the first time a US president publicly acknowledged MK Ultra's wrongdoing. They were granted a financial settlement, but no amount of money could replace the husband and father they had lost, or erase the sense that justice had never truly been served. Frank Olson's story is more than just a tragedy. It is a window into the moral void at the heart of MK Ultra. Here was a man who devoted his life to serving his country, only to be betrayed by the very agency he worked for. His death illustrates the cost of secrecy, the danger of unchecked power, and the human toll of experiments carried out without regard for the individuals caught inside them. To this day, the question lingers: did Frank Olson take his own life, overwhelmed by the trauma of being drugged and disillusioned by the work he had done? Or was he pushed, literally or figuratively, by a government determined to keep its darkest secrets buried? The truth may never be fully known. But what is undeniable is that Olson's death marked a turning point. For the first time, the hidden dangers of MK Ultra touched the public record. And while the agency worked hard to contain the fallout, cracks in the wall of secrecy had begun to appear. As more survivors came forward and more documents surfaced, the story of MK Ultra would grow harder and harder to deny. In the next chapter, we will hear the voices of those survivors, the whistleblowers and the victims who refused to stay silent and who carried the weight of truth into the light. For nearly 2 decades, MK Ultra thrived in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and shredded files. But secrets have a way of leaking, and the truth of what the CIA had done would not remain buried forever. The first cracks came not from politicians or journalists, but from the people who had lived through the experiments themselves. Survivors, men and women who had been used as unwitting subjects, began to speak out. Their stories were fragmented, painful, and often met with disbelief. But taken together, they painted a picture of a program that had crossed every ethical line imaginable. One of the most disturbing testimonies came from patients treated at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, under the care of psychiatrist Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. They had sought help for depression, anxiety, or minor psychological struggles. Instead, they became test cases in Cameron's MK Ultra-funded psychic driving experiments. Patients were kept in drug-induced comas for weeks, subjected to repeated electroshock sessions, and bombarded with recorded messages played on loops, phrases meant to erase their identities and rebuild them from scratch. The results were catastrophic. Survivors emerged with memory loss, impaired motor skills, and psychological scars that would never heal. Many had forgotten basic life skills, like how to cook or even recognize their own children. For years, they remained silent, unsure of what had been done to them, unsure if anyone would even believe their story. But eventually, some found the courage to speak, not just for themselves, but for the hundreds of others whose voices had been erased by trauma. In the United States, similar voices began to emerge. Prisoners remembered being promised lighter sentences in exchange for participating in medical research, only to be dosed with LSD until their minds unraveled. Former soldiers recalled tests they believed were part of training, only to discover years later that they had been manipulated in the name of science. Families of victims like Frank Olson demanded answers, refusing to accept the easy explanations given by the government. And then there were the insiders, whistleblowers who had once worked within the system. They, too, began to come forward. Some had participated directly in the experiments. Others had simply seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong. Their testimonies carried weight, because they pierced the CIA's wall of denial with first-hand accounts. Still, the path to the truth was anything but easy. Survivors faced skepticism, legal hurdles, and the crushing power of the US government. When lawsuits were filed, they were often dismissed under the pretext of national security. Many victims died without ever receiving compensation or acknowledgement. Others continued to battle the effects of experiments conducted decades earlier. Yet their persistence mattered. By the early 1970s, as America reeled from the Watergate scandal and growing distrust of government, journalists and congressional investigators began digging into the CIA's activities. The survivors' stories provided fuel. They were no longer isolated accounts. They were evidence. In 1975, the U.S. Senate's Church Committee launched hearings into intelligence abuses. For the first time, MKUltra was named publicly. For the first time, survivors and their families heard government officials admit that yes, experiments had been conducted, and yes, many of them were unethical. But admissions did not mean justice. The CIA had already destroyed the bulk of MKUltra's files in 1973, erasing much of the paper trail. What remained were fragments, enough to confirm wrongdoing, but not enough to give full answers. Survivors were left with pieces of their own stories missing, gaps that could never be filled. For many, speaking out was not just about seeking justice, but about reclaiming dignity. They wanted the world to know what had been done to them. They wanted their pain to be recognized, not hidden behind the excuse of Cold War necessity. Their voices also raised larger questions. What does it mean when a government experiments on its own citizens? How much secrecy is too much? And how can trust ever be restored once it has been broken in such a profound way? The whistleblowers and survivors of MKUltra did not bring the program down. By the time their stories reached daylight, MKUltra had already been quietly shuttered. But they forced the world to confront its legacy. They made sure it could not be forgotten. Their courage, to speak, to relive their trauma, to demand answers, ensured that MKUltra would not remain a footnote in history. It became a warning, a case study in how fear can corrode ethics, and how secrecy can enable abuse. As their stories spread, public outrage grew. And that outrage would eventually push Congress and the press to demand accountability from the CIA itself. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happened when MKUltra's secrets were finally dragged into the open, when the US government was forced to admit, however reluctantly, that the unimaginable had indeed been real. By the early 1970s, the walls of secrecy that had protected MKUltra for 2 decades were beginning to crack. The timing could not have been worse for the CIA. America was in the midst of the Watergate scandal, and trust in government was eroding fast. Newspapers were uncovering hidden abuses, and the public was more willing than ever to believe that officials in Washington had something to hide. Into this atmosphere of suspicion, fragments of MKUltra began to surface. It started with whispers. Journalists probing intelligence operations stumbled across references to CIA experiments with drugs. Survivors who had been ignored for years found their stories suddenly resonated in a climate where Americans were questioning everything. What once sounded unbelievable, the idea that the CIA had secretly drugged its own citizens, no longer seemed impossible. The breaking point came in 1974, when reporter Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times. He revealed that the CIA had conducted massive domestic surveillance programs, and, crucially, that it had also carried out illegal drug experiments on American citizens. The article sent shockwaves through the nation. Congress could no longer look away. In 1975, the U.S. Senate launched the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. Its mission was to investigate abuses by the intelligence community, from spying on Americans to covert assassination plots, and, buried in those investigations, MKUltra. For the first time, CIA officials were forced to answer questions in public. Under oath, they admitted that yes, the agency had funded and overseen experiments involving drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock. Yes, many of these experiments had been conducted without consent. And yes, the results were often unpredictable, even harmful. But the picture they painted was incomplete, because 2 years earlier, in 1973, most of MKUltra's files had been destroyed. Sidney Gottlieb, just before retiring, had ordered boxes of documents shredded. What might have been the full record of MKUltra's scope was reduced to ashes. What remained were about 20,000 documents stored in a budget archive that had been overlooked in the purge. These fragments offered a glimpse into the program's operations, its sub-projects, its funding mechanisms, its partnerships with universities and hospitals. But they did not tell the full story. For many victims, the details of what had been done to them were lost forever. Still, what was revealed was enough to shock the nation. Testimony showed how LSD had been tested on unsuspecting civilians, how safe houses had been set up for entrapment experiments, how psychiatric patients had been pushed beyond their breaking points. Frank Olson's death was revisited, his family finally learning that he had been secretly dosed by his own colleagues. The hearings painted a portrait of a program that had operated with almost no oversight, justified by Cold War fear but untethered from morality. Senator Church himself warned that the CIA's activities represented a systematic abuse of power and a threat to democracy. Public outrage grew. Editorials condemned the agency for betraying the trust of the people it claimed to serve. Citizens demanded safeguards to ensure such abuses could never happen again. Out of this pressure came reforms, new oversight committees in Congress, stricter rules on intelligence activities, and the creation of permanent structures meant to keep the CIA accountable. But accountability for MK Ultra itself was far less satisfying. Few of those responsible faced consequences. Sidney Gottlieb quietly retired, living the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Alan Dulles had died years earlier, his reputation as a Cold War spy master largely intact. The doctors and researchers who had taken CIA money to conduct experiments often faced little more than embarrassment, if their involvement became known at all. For the victims, justice was elusive. Some families filed lawsuits, but the courts often sided with the government's argument that national security shielded it from liability. A few settlements were granted, most famously to Frank Olson's family, but many survivors received nothing. Their pain remained unacknowledged, their stories half erased by the destruction of records. And yet, even in its incomplete form, the exposure of MK Ultra changed the conversation. It showed Americans that the government had crossed lines most thought impossible. It proved that secrecy could be dangerous, that fear could be used to justify abuses, and that even democratic institutions were vulnerable to corruption when unchecked. The fall of MK Ultra was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow unmasking, a program shuttered quietly in the early 1960s. Its files burned in 1973, its fragments dragged into daylight by the persistence of survivors, journalists, and a Senate committee willing to ask hard questions. But once the truth was out, it could never be buried again. MK Ultra became a stain on the CIA's history, a symbol of the dangers of unaccountable power. Still, questions lingered. How much had really been destroyed in the shredders of 1973? How many experiments were never documented in the first place? And how many stories, like Frank Olson's, would remain mysteries forever? In the next chapter, we turn from revelations to reflection, to the ethical reckoning sparked by MK Ultra, and the uncomfortable question of whether fear can ever justify such violations of human dignity. When the secrets of MK Ultra finally spilled into public view, Americans were horrified. But horror does not always lead to justice. The congressional hearings of the 1970s confirmed what many survivors had long claimed. The CIA had funded and overseen human experiments without consent. Yet, for all the outrage, the aftermath of MK Ultra was not defined by punishment, but by silence. The deeper question lingered: how could a democratic government, built on liberty and rights, justify such violations of human dignity? The answer, in part, was fear. The Cold War had created a climate where survival was seen as paramount. CIA officials insisted they had been racing against the Soviets, who they believed were perfecting brainwashing techniques. To them, the end justified the means. If America's enemies could control minds, then the US had to try, even if it meant trampling on the freedoms of its own citizens. This argument carried weight in Washington. But outside those closed doors, the American people saw it differently. Doctors had betrayed their oaths. Professors had taken CIA money to run experiments that hurt their students. Government scientists had turned fellow citizens into test subjects without consent. These were not just technical violations. They were ethical failures that cut to the core of trust in institutions. For survivors, the lack of accountability was almost as painful as the experiments themselves. Many sought justice through the courts. A few, like Frank Olson's family, won settlements after years of struggle. But most cases were dismissed. Judges ruled that national security prevented full disclosure, or that too much time had passed. Without the destroyed records, victims often could not even prove what had been done to them. It was a cruel irony. The very secrecy that enabled MK Ultra also protected its perpetrators from consequences. Even inside the CIA, accountability was scarce. Sidney Gottlieb, the program's architect, retired quietly. He was never charged with a crime. When he testified before Congress, he admitted to authorizing experiments but defended them as part of a larger mission to protect national security. Other officials echoed the same refrain. They had done what they thought was necessary. History, they implied, should understand. But history has not been so forgiving. Ethicists and historians point to MK Ultra as one of the most egregious examples of government overreach in modern America. It violated the most basic principle of human research, informed consent. It treated people as tools, not individuals. It blurred the line between medicine and manipulation. Even today, the echoes of those debates continue. Could there ever be a circumstance where violating rights is justified in the name of survival? Does national security excuse experiments on unwilling citizens? For many, the answer is clear: no. The moment we accept such logic, we risk losing the very freedoms we claim to defend. But the silence that followed MK Ultra speaks volumes. While the CIA admitted to mistakes, it never fully opened its files. Most of the program's records were gone, shredded long before the public learned of its existence. The agency's culture of secrecy remained intact, and the public was left with fragments, rumors, and unanswered questions. This silence created fertile ground for mistrust. If the government could do this once, what else might it have done? What else might it still be hiding? MK Ultra became a symbol not only of abuse, but of the dangerous gap between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. The survivors carried the heaviest burden. Many were dismissed as unreliable, their trauma brushed aside as exaggeration. Others lived with permanent scars, memory loss, psychological damage, fractured families. Few received recognition for their suffering. For them, the silence was personal. It was the sound of a government turning its back on those it had harmed. And so MK Ultra became not just a story about science gone wrong, but about accountability denied. It asked questions America was reluctant to answer. How far should a government go in the name of defense? Who holds power to account when secrecy is the norm? And what happens to the victims when truth comes too late? In the end, perhaps the most haunting part of MK Ultra is not what we know, but what we will never know. The destroyed files, the silenced voices, the experiments lost to time. They leave us with a story that is forever incomplete. Yet what remains is enough. Enough to remind us that ethics are fragile, that fear can erode principles, and that silence, in the face of abuse, is complicity. In the final chapter, we turn to the legacy of MK Ultra, how its shadow still stretches across culture, politics, and the way we think about power and secrecy today. The story of MK Ultra is not just a story of the past. It lingers in the present, echoing in the way we view power, secrecy, and the fragile line between security and freedom. When the CIA's mind control experiments were first revealed in the 1970s, they shocked the public. But over time, the shock gave way to something deeper: mistrust. Americans began to question not just what their government was doing, but what it might still be hiding. MK Ultra had planted a seed of doubt, one that continues to grow. Culturally, its shadow is enormous. The very phrase MK Ultra has become shorthand for conspiracy. Films, novels, and television shows borrow its imagery: shadowy agents, brainwashed assassins, hidden laboratories. From Hollywood thrillers to internet forums, MK Ultra lives on as a symbol of manipulation and control. Part of this is because the truth was never complete. With most of the records destroyed, we will never know the full scope of the program. That absence of clarity left room for speculation. If the CIA admitted to this much, many asked, what else might they have done? The unanswered questions became fuel for conspiracy theories, some rooted in fact, others drifting into fantasy. Yet beneath the exaggerations lies a core reality that is chilling enough. A government agency experimented on its own people, violating their rights in the name of Cold War survival. That fact alone ensures MK Ultra's place in history as a cautionary tale. For survivors, the legacy is personal. Many lived the rest of their lives with trauma that could not be undone. Families were fractured, careers ruined, trust destroyed. For them, MK Ultra was not an abstract scandal, but a wound that never healed. Their fight to be believed, to be recognized, continues to this day. For policymakers, MK Ultra became a case study in the dangers of unchecked secrecy. The Senate's Church Committee led to new oversight mechanisms meant to prevent intelligence agencies from operating without accountability. But critics argue those safeguards have not always worked. In moments of crisis, from 9/11 to the War on Terror, governments have again pushed ethical boundaries in the name of security. The ghost of MK Ultra hovers over every debate about torture, surveillance, and covert operations. For ethicists, MK Ultra is a reminder of what happens when science serves power instead of humanity. The program ignored the principle of informed consent, a cornerstone of medical ethics established after the Nuremberg trials. It showed how easily those principles could be cast aside when fear takes over. Today, every discussion about human experimentation, from genetic editing to artificial intelligence, carries an echo of MK Ultra's lessons. And for ordinary people, MK Ultra changed the way we imagine the world. It made us wary of authority, skeptical of official narratives. It blurred the line between science fiction and reality, because the truth was strange enough to rival any novel. Even now, decades later, MK Ultra remains a touchstone. When new scandals break, revelations about mass surveillance, disinformation campaigns, or secret programs, commentators invoke its name. This is the new MK Ultra, they say, drawing a line back to a program that showed how far the state might go when no one is watching. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is a question, one that refuses to go away. Can a democracy keep secrets without betraying its citizens? MK Ultra suggests the answer is complicated. Secrecy may be necessary in some cases, but when secrecy becomes a shield for abuse, it corrodes trust. And without trust, democracy itself falters. That is why MK Ultra matters today, not just as history, but as warning. It reminds us that rights must be defended constantly, that oversight must be vigilant, and that the pursuit of security can never come at the expense of humanity. In the end, MK Ultra was not just a program. It was a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of ethics under pressure, and the consequences of silence. Its victims remind us that behind every policy, every experiment, every secret, are human beings whose lives matter. As we close this story, we are left with both a chilling legacy and a vital lesson. The chilling legacy is that it happened, in plain sight, under the flag of democracy. The vital lesson is that it must never happen again. The secret was exposed. The warning remains.